Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we are diving deep into a topic that might seem counterintuitive at first. Why Ukraine's biggest fear right now isn't necessarily Russia, but rather Belarus. On the surface, it seems strange because Russia has been the main aggressor in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, and the shelling, destruction, and loss of life endured by Ukrainians is directly linked to Russian forces and strategy. But if we pull back and examine the broader strategic picture, the role of Belarus, its relationship with Russia, and Ukraine's fears about what could happen on that northern front reveals a complex and precarious situation that Ukraine's leaders are paying very close attention to right now. This isn't just about one country attacking another, but about the fears that come from geography, alliances, historical precedent, and political uncertainty, and how these factors all collude to make Belarus a flashpoint that could dramatically change the dynamics of the war. Belarus sits directly north of Ukraine, sharing a long land border that stretches hundreds of kilometers. In the early days of Russia's invasion, Russian forces launched offensives toward Kiev from Belarusian territory, shocking many observers and prompting Ukrainian forces to quickly reinforce defensive lines along that border. Ever since then, Ukraine has never entirely ruled out the possibility of renewed pressure from the north, because that border represents a strategic opening into the heart of Ukraine, one that could circumvent the heavily fortified eastern and southern fronts where Ukraine has concentrated so much of its defense. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other Ukrainian sources, Russia's use of Belarusian territory provides a strategic shortcut, enabling troops, weapons, and equipment to move more freely and threaten Ukraine from unexpected directions, complicating defense planning and forcing Kiev to guard against a second major front. Vocal part of the fear stems from history and precedent. In February 2022, some of the initial attacks came from Belarusian soil. Although those forces later withdrew, the memory of that northern offensive has not faded in Kiev's strategic calculus. The possibility that Russia could once again use Belarus as a staging area for attacks keeps Ukrainian intelligence and military planners vigilant. Even if Belarus itself does not launch an attack, just the presence of Russian military infrastructure, logistics routes, and training ground access inside Belarus makes the northern border a potential vulnerability that must be prepared for at all times. But the story of Belarus is complicated. Unlike Russia, Belarus is not a fully independent actor in the same way that Ukraine or many other countries are. Belarus's leader, Alexander Lukashenko, has long been seen as one of Russia's closest allies in the region, but his regime also operates with its own interests, fears, and calculations. Ukrainian intelligence sources have indicated that Lukashenko does not necessarily want to be dragged into the war as a full combatant. According to the former deputy head of Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, Lukashenko fears losing power and does many things not simply to help Russia, but because he fears the consequences for his own regime if he loses control. Belarus has effectively lost its military sovereignty, meaning Moscow exerts significant influence over its military decisions, further blurring the line between Belarusian agency and Russian strategic use of Belarusian terrain. News Ukraine RB.cu This reality creates a kind of psychological danger for Ukraine. On the one hand, Belarus's leadership may not want to send its own troops into the fight because public support for such a move is extremely low. Independent polling and expert analysis show that the vast majority of Belarusians are opposed to military involvement against Ukraine, with as little as 3% of the population expressing support for Belarus offering military assistance to Russia against Ukraine. Many Belarusians are deeply opposed to their country being involved in the conflict at all and fear that such involvement would be catastrophic for Belarus itself, potentially inviting devastating retaliation or even wider regional war. Atlantic Council Belarusian public sentiment is crucial because it highlights a real disconnect between what the leadership wants and what the people actually feel. In a normal democratic society, public opinion has some influence over decisions of war and peace, but in Belarus's authoritarian context, Lukashenko's regime has a well-documented history of suppressing dissent and quashing protests through force. This means that even though the public may strongly oppose military involvement in the Ukraine war, they are largely powerless to influence the direction of state policy because the regime maintains strict control over political expression and civil liberties. Atlantic Council. This disconnect fuels a different kind of fear for Ukraine, that Belarus could be a willing host for Russian military forces, infrastructure, and operations without officially entering the war. Belarus has allowed Russia to use its territory as a launch pad for air raids and missile strikes against Ukrainian cities, and Russian forces stationed there could theoretically strike again if the Kremlin chose to open a northern front. This enables Russia to threaten Ukraine from multiple directions and forces Ukraine to allocate troops and resources to defend areas that might otherwise be less of a concern. Atlantic Council. Ukraine's concern is compounded by military exercises and drills that involve both Russia and Belarus. Joint exercises such as Zapad 2025 involved substantial numbers of troops and equipment, and were officially framed as defensive readiness tests for the Union state of Russia and Belarus. These exercises triggered alarm among Western analysts and Ukrainian planners alike, who saw in past Zapad exercises precedents for aggressive military campaigns. For example, previous iterations of the Zapad drills preceded major Russian military actions and were interpreted as rehearsals for invasion scenarios. Although the 2025 exercise was described as scaled down compared to earlier ones, its existence reinforces the perception that Belarus could once again be used as a springboard for offensive operations. Wikipedia +1. At the same time, some Western analysts have questioned whether these drills truly signal imminent plans for invasion, or whether they are more about political messaging and deterrence. After the 2025 Zapad exercises, some commentators argued that the scenario of a large-scale offensive from Belarus was overblown, and that the exercises themselves did not represent a real preparation for invasion. Regardless of the actual intent or military capability present, the mere possibility of such operations creates strategic uncertainty that Ukraine cannot ignore. Kiev Post. Another layer of complexity lies in the fact that Ukraine's intelligence community has at times suggested that talk of an imminent Belarusian attack could itself be part of a Russian information or psychological operation aimed at sapping Ukrainian morale, sowing confusion, and forcing Kiev to spread its defenses thin. Wars are fought not only with weapons but with narratives, fear, and uncertainty, and Russia has long employed information operations as part of its broader strategy. This makes it difficult to separate genuine military threats from orchestrated psychological campaigns designed to keep Ukraine and its allies off balance. Reddit. Belarus's internal dynamics also matter because they could have long-term implications for both Ukraine and the broader region. Belarusian volunteer formations such as the Belarusian Volunteer Corps and the Terror Battalion have been fighting on the Ukrainian side, made up of Belarusians who oppose Moscow's influence and want to push back against Russian imperial ambitions. These volunteers represent a segment of Belarusian society that rejects the Lukashenko regime's alignment with Russia and is willing to fight for Ukraine's sovereignty. Their existence underscores the internal divisions within Belarus and highlights the potential for future instability or even uprising inside Belarus itself. Such internal strife could have unpredictable effects on the war and on the security of Ukraine's northern border. Wikipedia +1. Then there's the geopolitical question of how Belarus's position affects Ukraine's relationships with NATO and the West. Belarus's geographical location makes it uniquely positioned as a buffer state between Russia and NATO members such as Poland and the Baltic states. Any change in Belarus's role, from passive host to active participant in the conflict, could escalate tensions with NATO and draw in broader security commitments. Even the perception of Belarus as an unstable or unpredictable actor has implications for NATO defensive planning and for Ukraine's hopes of greater integration with Western security structures. France 24. At the heart of all this is the paradox that Ukraine's biggest fear isn't simply the obvious threat of Russian tanks, missiles, and soldiers, but the unknowns represented by Belarus. Will Belarus stay out of the war? Will Lukashenko be forced by Moscow to commit troops? Could Belarusian territory be used again for strategic operations against Ukraine? And what might happen if political instability inside Belarus gives way to events that suddenly change the trajectory of the war? These questions highlight how war is not only fought on battlefields but in diplomacy, alliances, geography, and perceptions. Ukraine's concern about Belarus isn't rooted in irrational fear, but in a sober assessment of how the conflict could evolve and how vulnerabilities on the northern border could be exploited in ways that Ukraine might least expect. In conclusion, while Russia remains the principal adversary in the war, Belarus represents a multifaceted and potentially destabilizing variable that Ukraine must constantly monitor and plan for. The fear isn't just that Belarus will attack, it's that Belarus could be used as a means to enable further aggression, to stretch Ukraine's defenses, and to open up unforeseen challenges that could make an already brutal conflict even more complicated. It is this uncertainty, this combination of geopolitical vulnerability and political unpredictability, that makes Belarus one of Ukraine's biggest strategic concerns right now.